Good evening and welcome back to the Rules Committee. Today, the committee, as it welcomes back members of Congress from the break, all the fun we had at home working to consider what we have left for the remaining weeks. And tonight, the committee will consider H.R. 1635, Empowering Students Through Enhanced Financial Counseling Act, and H.R. 4606, Ensuring Small-Scale LNG Certainty and Access Act. And I know a number of members who are here to talk about that tonight. First, we're going to consider H.R. 4606. H.R. 4606 helps improve the application process under the Natural Gas Act for the import or export of small volumes of natural gas. This bill also improves access to new markets for American exports, including the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. Currently, the Natural Gas Act does not specify an amount threshold for triggering the Department of Energy's lengthy regulatory process for the exploration of natural gas. So with the U.S. now as the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas and projected to become a net energy exporter, it is important that we have a fair and thorough application process. This bill places small-scale exports on a level playing field with exports to the free trade agreement countries, and the legislation provides greater regulatory certainty and a clear timetable for moving forward with capital-intensive projects that create and sustain American jobs. Next, the Rules Committee will consider H.R. 1635. H.R. 1635 promotes financial literacy through enhancing counseling for recipients of financial federal aid nationwide. Americans own more than $1.45 trillion in student loan debt, outstripping credit cards and auto loans as the country's leading source of non-housing debt. This bill ensures borrowers, both students and parents, who participate in the federal loan program receive interactive counseling each year that reflects their individual borrowing circumstances and situations. Many students graduate unable to manage their loans and that they have taken to finance their education, that lead to significant hardships for borrowers and greater risks for taxpayers. H.R. 1635 aims to educate our students and improve their awareness of the responsibilities that they undertook at the time they took their student loans. I am delighted that we have these two important bills that are before us. One, dealing with student loans and financial responsibility and access to students to further develop these ideas, as well as jobs related to LNG. So another beautiful day at the Rules Committee. I would now yield such time as he would choose to have the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome back, everybody. Happy to be here. Mr. Chairman, it's nice to be back after the district work period. I had a very productive August. I visited community health centers. I visited the town of Webster, which was hit by tornado. Luckily, nobody was hurt, but there was some damage to many of the buildings. I had countless constituent meetings to talk about health care and veterans issues and wages. I had conversations about the crisis in the Middle East. I met with immigration groups, people still concerned about the number of children who have been are still separated from their parents. I met with senior citizens, education groups, anti-hunger groups. I met with students. I even toured over a dozen farms during my break. And that's just a partial list of what I did during my August recess. But one thing stands out. Would you believe that nobody at all, not one person mentioned either of these bills that we are meeting with today? In fact, no one even mentioned liquefied natural gas at all, not once. And while this financial counseling bill may be fine, no one brought this up as the critical issue facing Congress. You guys had over a month to figure out what we should do when we came back in session. And this is what you came up with? I have to be honest, I'm a little bit underwhelmed The House is in session for just 11 days before funding for the government expires, and not a single appropriations bill has been signed into law. We have a lot of work to do in a short period of time. Is a bill on small-scale liquefied natural gas exports really what we should be doing today? Nearly all of us support giving students and their families more and better information to make good decisions on funding their education. That's why an identical bill passed the House 405 to 11 in the 113th Congress and passed by voice vote in the last Congress. So why don't we instead do something of real substance for a change, like lowering health care costs or dealing with the high cost of prescription drugs or increasing wages, or how about an infrastructure bill that the President promised? Or at the very least, why aren't we more concerned about keeping the government open? So frankly, I'm concerned because the President and congressional Republicans don't seem to have a very good track record on that front. The Republican Party is in charge of the House, the Senate, and the White House. But even under their complete control, the government has shut down twice this year already, and we are fast approaching a third time. Now, President Trump tweeted in July that he was willing to shut down the government if Democrats don't vote for his offensive border wall. Mr. Chairman, has anyone in the majority spoken to the President on this? Is he still willing to shut down the entire federal government over such an extreme idea? So I know this committee will meet again tomorrow and possibly later in the week, and I hope we see legislation to avert a government shutdown sooner rather than later. Again, funding runs out in 11 legislative days, counting today. So let's stop spinning our wheels and get some real work done around here. And with that, I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. You know, I'm
glad to be
hoping-
back.
Yes, sir. I'm hoping that we can avoid the kinds of shutdowns that came because it was only up to Republicans to fund the government, it seemed like, and including the CHIP reauthorization that was done, the longest 10-year reauthorization that people all over the country said, shame on Republicans, should have included Dreamers in there, and then we included Dreamers, and the first two bills that people had to vote for, I don't believe many Democrats, if any, voted for that. That would have been an answer to the Dreamer issue. I did note, however, during the break that the Labor Department revised the numbers to 4.2% GDP growth, and there's still some 6 to 9 million jobs that are available in the country that they're looking for people to come to work. So it sure beats the stuffings out of not having jobs available. So another beautiful day at the Rules Committee. I'm delighted that we have two distinguished members who are here who will help us to participate. The distinguished gentleman, Mr. Johnson, 26-year member of the United States Air Force. Mr. Johnson, could I have you as a member of this committee, Energy and Commerce Committee, please come to the table. And distinguished gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, we're delighted that you're here. I was looking for Mr. Garamendi. I don't see Mr. Garamendi. I know he had asked to be a part of this panel, and we would include him when he gets here. Gentlemen, we're going to discuss with you today H.R. 4606, Ensuring Small-Scale LNG Certainty and Access Act. And Mr. Johnson, we're delighted that you're here. Without objection, anything you and Mr. Pallone brought in writing will be made in order. Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm honored to be before the Rules Committee today to talk about H.R. 4606, the Ensuring Small-Scale LNG Certainty and Access Act. You know, I found it interesting listening to the ranking member's comments about the need for infrastructure bills. This could easily be interpreted as an infrastructure bill. Our energy infrastructure is something that we're trying to build out. America is becoming an international leader on the energy front. We're the largest producer of oil and gas today by 2040. We're going to be, by 2026, we're going to be a net energy exporter. First time we've done that since the 1950s. So permitting reforms along the energy infrastructure plane is certainly something that we're interested in doing, and I appreciate the opportunity to help us do that today. H.R. 4606 the Ensuring Small-Scale LNG Certainty and Access Act will help the U.S. realize its full economic potential regarding small-scale natural gas exports and associated technology. There is interest for U.S. natural gas in the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, although not in the large quantities that the current large-scale domestic exporting facilities were built to address via conventional liquefied natural gas tankers. This legislation will help the U.S. act on these interests through greater regulatory certainty and a reduction in administrative regulatory burdens. This bipartisan legislation provides that applications under the Natural Gas Act for the importation or exportation of small volumes of natural gas defined as 0.14 billion cubic feet per day shall be granted without modification or delay. Importantly, this legislation is the product of bipartisan work and compromise, as I collaborated with Representative Gene Green and several other ENC committee Democrats to ensure that important environmental procedures and safeguards are maintained by inserting language stating that an application must not require an environmental impact statement or environmental assessment to be approved in order to qualify under 4606. In other words, the NEPA review process remains in place. Currently, the Natural Gas Act does not specify an amount threshold for triggering the Department of Energy's lengthy regulatory process for the exportation of natural gas. Therefore, all projects, whether exporting small or large amounts of natural gas, undergo the same process. In this day and age, with the U.S. now the world's leading producer of oil and natural gas and projected to become a net energy exporter in just a few short years, does this really make sense? I submit that it does not. Natural gas production is at an all-time high, and reserves are so large that they are predicted to meet domestic demand for almost a century. H.R. 4606 will encourage the domestic industries involved in the emerging small-scale markets and associated technologies to take full advantage of economic opportunities throughout the Western Hemisphere. Companies currently in operation, under construction, or close to construction, or those exploring new small-scale possibilities will be incentivized to move forward with new investments and opportunities under this bill. This is especially important considering that the Dominican Republic is the only Caribbean country to have signed a free trade agreement with the United States. In other words, the Dominican Republic is the only country that will not trigger a lengthy regulatory review process before U.S. natural gas can be exported into the region. And as Puerto Rico continues to rebuild after the devastating hurricane in 2017, increased shipments and availability of small-scale American LNG can help the island meet its energy needs as well. U.S. small-scale natural gas exports can also provide countries in the Caribbean and Central America with a new source of energy, as many are reliant on Venezuelan fuel oil that has been used to gain influence in the region. In fact, a stable alternative source of U.S. energy has been a goal of both Republicans and Democrats alike throughout recent history. For instance, former Vice President Biden was a proponent of helping the Caribbean region use more U.S. energy, including natural gas, and recognizing the need of a U.S. engagement, the previous administration, President Obama and his administration, created the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative. Similarly, the Trump administration recently issued a final rule similar to H.R. 4606, and while I'm very encouraged by that rule, it's important that we enact a congressional mandate that provides further certainty to American companies that want to export to these emerging markets. The benefits of natural gas exports are clear, as numerous Department of Energy studies and various independent studies have concluded. They are a net positive to our U.S. economy. These studies have found that LNG exports support thousands of American jobs, many of them within the manufacturing sector. ICF International estimates that these jobs will occur across the entire value chain, translating into millions of dollars in new wages for American workers. In fact, the Department of Energy once again highlighted the benefits of LNG exports with a study it released back in June. This study, which is in addition to 4 other studies commissioned by the Department of Energy since 2012, presented further data that demonstrates how LNG exports are a net benefit to our economy. Before I conclude, I'd like to address a concern that I've heard from some of my colleagues, that this bill would allow applicants to avoid the scrutiny needed for larger projects by splitting them into smaller segments. Let's break this down for a second. These LNG companies are building to economies of scale. The financial viability of stacking or combining many small-scale trains is simply not viable. The operating cost would surely cause the cost of the gas to be uncompetitive in the global market. Lastly, we have consulted with DOE's Office of Fossil Energy regarding this concern. Through staff discussions, DOE has indicated that it would not accept requests by authorization holders seeking to combine more than one small-scale export authorization as an indirect means of expanding DOE-approved export volumes from their facility. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge every member in this room to support strengthening U.S. geopolitical influence, U.S. job creation, and economic growth by supporting H.R. 4606, the Ensuring Small-Scale LNG Certainty and Access Act. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Johnson, thank you very much. Mr. Pallone, we're delighted that you're back. Distinguished gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I like your positive attitude about being back and how beautiful the committee is. But I have to say that I associate myself completely with the remarks of Mr. McGovern, because I believe that this bill is completely unnecessary and at best is actually might be harmful. And so it's no surprise that you haven't heard anything about the bill, because the bill isn't really necessary, in my opinion. I say that because in terms of substance, the Department of Energy currently conducts a public interest review of all applications to export LNG to a country without a free trade agreement with the United States. And that public interest review appears to be working fine. To date, DOE has granted final approval for 29 applications to export LNG, and over the past few years, the U.S. has emerged as one of the largest exporters in the world, as my colleague said. There's no backlog of applications or delay at the DOE to speak of for these applications, and the Trump administration has taken every opportunity to promote U.S. natural gas abroad. So in July, the Department of Energy finalized a rule to automatically approve applications to export less than 0.14 billion cubic feet per day of LNG. And the rule declares that all small-scale exports are always in the public interest, removes longstanding consumer protections of the Natural Gas Act, prevents the public from having an opportunity to know about or provide input on export proposals, and violates the public hearing requirement of the Natural Gas Act. So basically what this says is, if it's small enough, then the application is deemed in the public interest. And I think that makes no sense to simply say that everything goes out the window. One of my amendments, and I would ask, Mr. Chairman, that all of the amendments be put in order and that we actually have an open rule, but one of my amendment amongst the four that Democrats have put forward basically says that assures that the public has notice of the application and has an opportunity for public input through a public hearing. To me, this idea of just deeming this in the public interest without any kind of notice, hearing, anything at all, is just the wrong way to go. But it's also unnecessary because right now all these applications are being approved, even the large-scale ones. In addition to that, since that rule has been finalized, I don't understand why we need legislation, because the President has already finalized a rule that allows us to do what Mr. Johnson's bill would do. So again, I just think it's completely unnecessary. The harm, though, is that an unrestricted export policy could lead to even higher levels of LNG exports, which could have a significant impact on domestic natural gas prices and adversely affect American consumers and manufacturers. Many manufacturers have complained that unfettered exports would exacerbate, create a situation where they have to pay more for their energy and make it more difficult for them to manufacture. But beyond the economics, there's also the fact that the exports could exacerbate climate change by encouraging more fossil fuel extraction, displacing carbon-free sources of power, Right now, we have high methane leak rates, and increased demand for U.S. LNG would likely offset any climate benefits associated with natural gas use. So for Congress and the administration to prioritize such a policy at a time when methane pollution is warming the planet, that's the potential harm in all this. So if I could, Mr. Chairman, I would simply ask that my full statement, ask unanimous consent included in the record. But my point is, this is not necessary. And if anything, the damage could be that we could actually encourage even more of these LNG exports, and that would be harmful to both the climate as well as to our manufacturing policy and consumers with higher prices. With that, I'll yield, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Pallone, thank you very much. Mr. Pallone, to answer your question, it's on page 4 of the committee report. And I think Mr. Johnson, while he alluded to it, I'm not sure he said it completely. But in testimony before the committee, DOE Assistant Secretary Stephen Winberg stated that 4606 would have qualifying applications granted without modification or delay, saving several months of review time at minimum.
But my point
Mr. Johnson, is time money in the free enterprise system?
I'm sorry, time is money.
Time is money.
Is absolutely money, especially for these kinds of projects, Mr. Chairman, where investors have to put their money on the line and they wait and they wait and they wait and they wait for permitting processes.
Yeah, Mr. Pallone wanted to make sure, he said, there's nobody that's been really denied under this, but it is a cost of time and effort and requires costs to go up when you have to file, when you have to wait, when you have to answer questions, when you have to do something, when we know it's a good, safe product. It's an opportunity for this country to become efficient in what it does. So to answer that question, I would say to you that without any question, it allows them to know that they can get in the business and get it done. Is that what you'd say?
It's certainty that we're trying to provide here, Mr. Chairman. That's why the bill is named what it is.
That seems like a good enough reason to me why we're doing this today, and I'm delighted. I think that the hearing that was done on this behalf points up once again how important it is to listen to job creators about the things that they need. I want to
and Mr. Chairman, I might add that at least 5 Democrats on the Energy and Commerce Committee agreed with me that this is something that is needed.
Well, I did note that there were a number of Mr. Green, Mr. Doyle, Mr. Butterfield, Mr. McNary, Mr. Lujan, Mr. Schrader evidently voted one way, so thank you very much. Chairman Cole, by the way, congratulations. You guys had a great
We had a good opener.
University of Oklahoma.
Appreciate that very much.
Yes, sir.
The Buckeyes won too, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, by
And that
77
very convincing
points.
win as well.
Yeah.
So, we maybe will, between us, break the SEC monopoly on national championships down the road. We'd love to have that opportunity. I'm sure you would too. But Alabama looked awfully good as well. So did Georgia. So it's going to be a good season. Just a couple of quick remarks. And not specifically my friend in Massachusetts, but I spent a lot of time in my district, and not surprisingly, we do talk a lot about natural gas in Oklahoma. So I heard an awful lot about it in the month of August. But more interesting to me, I began the break with a congressional delegation trip to Eastern Europe, and where I heard most about natural gas was in Poland, in Lithuania, and in Denmark, where they were very anxious to see increased American production and, frankly, try to find ways to lessen their dependence on Russia. So this is not only a product, I'm going to disagree with my friend from New Jersey, I guarantee you the biggest increase in living standards most people have gotten in the last decade is lower cost for heating and cooling their home, and as a side product, lower gasoline costs because of productivity of the oil and gas industry, private enterprise driven, not because of some government program. And we've had the most rapid decline in greenhouse gases because of natural gas, which is much less prone to produce that. So with all due respect, and look, we're also a big wind energy producing state. We get over 30% of our electricity that we produce in Oklahoma is produced by wind. So I'm not against alternatives or anything of that nature. But anybody that thinks we're getting rid of carbon-based energy anytime in anybody's lifetime in this room, good luck with that. I'm all for the efforts. I've been supportive of that. I've actually passed with my good friend, Mr. Blumenauer, legislation when Democrats were in the majority on wind power and small wind engines. So again, there's lots of this stuff on all sides that are good. I really am for real all of the above, but I'm not going to condemn an industry that has lowered the cost of living for almost every American, has increased the domestic security of the United States by moving us, as my good friend suggested, toward energy independence, and is beginning to provide some of our allies with the means of weaning themselves off of Russian natural gas to either bargain for a lower price for their own consumers and or to provide some strategic alternatives for them so they're not at the mercy of a power that has used energy as a weapon. So I think there's a lot of good things that are going on in this particular sector. I'm particularly pleased that you're looking for ways to expedite that process, and I agree. It's just because we've got a regulatory or an export process that over time works, if we can do things faster, so much the better. And if we can give people cheaper energy and a more consistent supply of energy so they can chart their own destinies, so much the better. So I want to applaud you. I look forward to supporting the legislation, and I join my chairman in pointing out and supporting. In fact, I appreciate your Democratic colleagues on your committee that voted that way. And I suspect if we get it to the floor, there'll be a lot of Democrats that support this legislation. So it's actually a bipartisan initiative, and to suggest anything else, I think, belies what the vote in the committee was, and frankly, just flies in the face of what the evidence is, that this has been something that's good. And not just good for traditional energy states. I note when Chairman went through that list, there were some folks from Western Pennsylvania who I think would be quick to point what a good thing natural gas has been in terms of providing jobs and opportunities, and again, getting them back into the energy producing business where they've been a major player, quite frankly, for literally 150 years in a variety of different forms of carbon-based energy. So it's a good piece of legislation. Look forward to supporting it. Yield back.
Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. McGovern?
No, I said what I had to
Mr.
say.
McGovern, could I?
Well, let me yield to Mr. Pallone to respond to.
Yeah,
your
I
question.
appreciate it. My whole point is that this is already the law. In other words, right now, if you have an application, even a large one for LNG, they're routinely approved, and as in the public interest. There's a rule by the administration that has been finalized that says the same thing as what Mr. Johnson's bill says. So again, I go back to what you said, Mr. McGovern, which is, why are we spending time on something that's already allowed when there's no evidence that there's any problem getting these approved? The danger I see is that if you pass this law and then at some point down the road, there is one of these applications that's not in the public interest, people will have no idea because there would be no obligation to tell anybody that have a hearing or have any public comment or anything. And we would have to go back and pass another law saying, okay, we're not going to have an exception and we're going to review these just like we review everything else. And it's true what Mr. Johnson and the chairman and the vice chair have been saying, that this administration and the previous administration both have been encouraging natural gas, and everything you said about use of natural gas is true. But the point is, there's no need for this. And if anything, I think the danger, the precedent is set that we're just not going to have any review at all, even in an expedited fashion. And there's no opportunity at all for somebody to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe this one is a problem and should have some kind of a public comment. That's why I have that amendment that would at least bring back the idea of having a public comment at a hearing, because I do think there's a danger in just saying that these are simply deemed in the public interest without any review. But that's what the rule says anyway. So again, I don't know, I'm repeating myself, but I just want you to understand why what you said is so true, Mr. McGovern.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. Distinguished gentleman from Georgia. By the way, those dogs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 45-0, I believe.
Oh, your brother back there grinning when I talked about that.
Well, you may have even heard him. He didn't keep it to himself. It's going to be a big year.
Score in the
Georgia
Buckeye
football.
games, Mr. Chairman, 77-30.
I saw the Ohio State game. Wasn't there, but I saw it.
I appreciate all my colleagues talking about what they heard from their folks back home during August, because
Yeah, I didn't get a chance to do that yet, but
it's valuable. That's why it's valuable time, and everyone comes back a little more energized. What I heard more often than not, Mr. Chairman, I was talking about things we'd done together, like extending career and technical education, which is very important in this field. I talked about how we moved NDAA, not just for the first time, but for the more than 4 decades worth every single year on time, no matter who the president is, in a bipartisan way. I went all down the list of the bipartisan things that we've gotten done together as a country, and constituent after constituent said, well, Rob, I had never heard of that. Why isn't anybody talking about that? And so to walk into a Rules Committee meeting, first thing back on Tuesday, and have a bill, what we could have heard from the minority is, I can't believe you guys are bringing up bills that are supported only by Republicans. And we do hear that from time to time. That's not the case with this bill. This is a bipartisan bill. What we do hear from time to time is, I can't believe you guys are bringing up bills that hadn't gone through the committee process. Well, that's not the case with this bill. It did go through the committee's process. So instead of starting our day with welcome back, glad to see you, happy we could get together, thank you for bringing bipartisan legislation, thank you for sending it through regular order, I disagree with the content, but let the chips fall where they may, we end up with it's all bad news. And I have to ask my friend representing the minority, because time and time again, you bring me information that I've not heard before. I enjoy when you're before the Rules Committee, because I always take home something more than I would have taken home otherwise. I told that to my constituents back home over August 2, that if folks knew how hard people they didn't like when they watched them on TV were actually working behind the scenes to make a positive difference, they would view Congress differently. But what I understood you to say is, on the one hand, there's no need for this legislation because the regulation already exists and this is already the law of the land. But on the other side, this is dangerous legislation because it's going to encourage more consumption of natural gas overseas and has the potential to raise prices for consumers here at home. I can understand how either of those could be true. This is the law of the land, so the bill changes nothing. Or this bill is going to make dramatic changes to the law of the land, and thus consequences for consumers and consumption may occur. What I don't understand is how both can be true.
Well, the problem is this. The reason we have this review process is because if it's a country that we don't have a free trade agreement with, we want to see if it's in the public interest. I guess, there's problems, sending things to countries that we don't necessarily view as allies, all right, or don't have the best relationship with. But my point is that what's wrong with having this public interest review? We've been doing it for all the larger ones. We've been doing it for several years now, and nobody gets denied, right? So why do you have to simply say, well, we're going to just deem this in the public interest, when in fact the process seems to be working well? Have some review. Let's have an opportunity to at least be heard, which is what we do. Doesn't seem to be stopping anybody or making anybody delayed in any way. But beyond that, you've already got it, right? In other words, the president has already done this as a rule that's been finalized. So, I kind of go back. I'm not going to tell you what I did during the break because I'm sure you don't want to hear it. But everything that Mr. McGovern said about, we have so many other things to do. Why are we doing something that's completely unnecessary? There is the outlying possibility that, one of these maybe shouldn't just be deemed in the public interest because maybe it would raise prices or it would have some negative impact on our economy or on the environment. That's my only point. It's not, look, you mentioned some of the Democrats voted for it. Well, I'm not surprised because if it doesn't do anything, it's like sure, what do I care? I'll vote for it. It doesn't do anything anyway. But I don't take that attitude. I take the attitude that we should be doing other things. But I don't want to go through a whole list of what we should be doing. But
Well,
it just seems you're wasting your time for nothing. That's all. I don't want to be insulting, but
Well, and of course, that's the nature of the legislation. We go through this whole process. It never affects the outcome whatsoever. So we're wasting all of this time for nothing. And so let's try to streamline the process so that we don't don't waste that.
But you already
that
have
time.
the rule that allows you to get rid of everything.
Well, and that's I guess that's the issue I would take. And I'm really surprised that you're not defending that from a committee perspective. I
Oh,
think,
no, I agree with Mr. Don't get me wrong, I like the gentleman a lot, and you're absolutely right. This went through regular order. I have no objection to that. It's true that some Democrats voted against it, voted for the bill. It's true that, natural gas is, better than coal. I'm not arguing any of those points, but I'm simply saying, I don't know what we're doing here, frankly. Why just deem something, the whole process says, we're going to look at this and see if it's in the public interest. Now you're not doing that anymore. It seems to me that's not a good idea.
but as we both parties over many decades have been complicit in sending all of the Article I power that we were supposed to exercise on behalf of our bosses together down the street to the
Oh, if you're
to the
going to get down that
administration.
road and talk about the imperial presidency, I'm with you.
Absolutely. And I took that issue with President Obama when he
I
did
did
things by
too.
regulation that I thought we should do by statute. And in this case, President Trump is doing something by regulation that I would argue, you know what, if this is to be done, we should be doing this by statute. I understand that you don't agree with the underlying policy, but do you agree that if this is to be the law of the land, as you have stated that it is, that it should be the law of the land because Congress said so instead of because the administration
Well,
said so?
you're going down a slippery slope here, because you and I probably should get together and talk about the imperial presidency and why I think that we should take back a lot of things that have been given to the executive branch over the years, including tariffs, for example. But I'll leave it at that.
Don't leave it at
You
that.
wanna
Let's
meet
get
with
together
me?
and fix that.
Let's
Don't
get
leave it at
together.
that. Let's do solve that. It tends to be too late when we get together to
All right,
to solve
I'll
that.
take you up on it.
I'll ask my friend from Ohio. Do you know of those applications that have been filed? How many of them fall in this small export category? I could not find that information. I'm just curious.
I don't have that number right off the top of my head. What I can tell you in response to several things I've heard is that this does not change the NEPA review process. That was one of the issues that was necessary in getting my Democrat colleagues on the committee to come across and support the bill in the first place. So there is still that review process. If this was to trigger a NEPA review, it still has to be done, and it can't be processed expeditiously under this bill. So that's number one. Number two, Mr. Cole said something earlier. I think we oftentimes underestimate the international, the leverage on the international stage that putting America into the LNG export game really brings. He mentioned Russia. Russia gets about 50% of its revenue from the sale of oil and gas. 70% of that gas is sold to friends and allies in Europe that have no choice, and Russia uses it as a hammer. And about 80% of that resource flows through pipelines that go through the Ukraine. Anybody that thinks that the Russians want to help the Ukrainian people, that's not the case. They want the land because that's where their pipelines are going through. The last thing that we need is for the Russians to begin selling their energy reserves to people here in the Western Hemisphere when we have an opportunity to capture that market.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Pallone was absolutely right when he said this is something that was supported by the last administration as well as this administration. This issue doesn't fall down traditional partisan lines, whether you want to talk about the former EPA administrator or the former Department of Energy secretary, or as Mr. Johnson just mentioned, anybody who's worried about the world stage. The Democratic presidential candidate last cycle, Hillary Clinton, was not shy about her support for natural gas. Tim Kaine, not shy about his support for natural gas. I understand that folks may disagree on this issue, but they disagree because of energy policy, not because of partisanship. And I'm grateful to my friends for being here today. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Yes, back. It's time to send the gentleman from Florida. Judge, how are you? I'm fine, Mr. Chairman. I have no
No questions, but I'm glad to see my two committee members here. And Mr. Johnson, thank you for bringing the bill to us today, and look forward to supporting on the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
HR 1635, Empowering Students Through Enhanced Financial Counseling Act. The gentleman, Mr. Guthrie, is here representing the Community Education Workforce. The gentleman from California is here, Mr. Tanco, Takano. Mr. Lamb, I thought I saw. Mr. Lamb, why don't you pull a chair up right there? We'll have you guys move over and we'll continue this. Mr. Lamb, welcome. We're delighted that you're here with us. I think this is your second time at the Rules Committee? First time. Gentleman's here for the first time. I see the gentleman in the morning, and I guess I've gotten used to him. Good. Ms. Guthrie, we're delighted that you're here. Without objection to anything either of you brought in writing will be entered in the record. The distinguished gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Sessions and Ranking Member McGovern. I'm happy to be here today to help address several challenges facing Americans pursuing higher education. One of these challenges is understanding the federal financial aid process. Unfortunately, the policies in place to promote financial literacy of aid recipients are seriously lacking. In fact, in a survey of current student and recent graduates who are carrying a high level of student loan debt, more than 40% couldn't remember ever receiving financial counseling, even though it's required before receiving their first loan. The current system is ineffective in failing to help students make the best financial decisions for their future. Without the information and assistance they need, applicants could make a choice about financial aid. They'll have detrimental consequences not only in the near term, but for years to come. That's why I've worked with Representative Bonamici. I'll give my condolences. I know America lost I think a great personality, a great person, and she lost a family member, Neil Simon, this week. So I always wanted to meet him. So I think it was her husband's uncle, and he always had serious problems with he addressed serious issues with great wit, and I always appreciated that. But back to where I am, so my condolences to her and her husband. This is HR 1635, the Empowering Students Through Enhanced Financial Counseling Act. I'm glad to be here with Mr. Takano on this bill as well. This bill will help Americans make smart decisions when it comes to financing their higher education by improving the timing and frequency of loan counseling. First, it will require individuals to receive counseling before signing on the dotted line, helping students understand the responsibilities they are taking on and keeping them well-informed every step of the way. After their entrance counseling, students will receive annual counseling regarding their loans and finances so that students can continue to understand their financial obligations and make informed decisions regarding their loans. Additionally, the legislation will bolster exit counseling to help borrowers make smart financial decisions as they leave school. It's not enough to be aware of financial options and commitments before and during school. We need to empower students to make smart financial decisions as they begin to repay their college loan commitments as well. HR 65 will also enhance the content of financial counseling, ensuring it's tailored to a borrower's unique needs and individual circumstances, and it will require the Secretary of Education to maintain a consumer-tested online counseling tool for institutions to use in providing required financial counseling. As college costs continue to rise, students and their families cannot afford the cost of making poor financial decisions in pursuit of a higher education. The Empowering Students Through Enhanced Financial Counseling Act will help students receive the information they need to understand their options and make financially responsible decisions as they do work to achieve their goals. The University of Indiana has this in place, and that is the model that we have followed and understand and follow. Ms. Bonamici and I looked at, and they had 11% overall student loan burden compared to peer schools. Also, it's my first time to be here since the passing of my, I say fellow Kentuckian, but a great New Yorker, and Ms. Slaughter, and former chairwoman of this committee. And she loved Central New York, but she never lost her Kentucky accent. So I always appreciated my time spent with her. So I want to say that's the first time I've been here since she's passed away. So thank you for considering this legislation tonight, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Guthrie, thank you very much. The discussion about Ms. Slaughter is always welcome, and in order here, we do miss her too. And was that Bill Simon, who was Secretary of Treasury?
Excuse me, Neil Simon, the playwright.
Oh, Neil Simon, I'm
the
sorry, I
playwright.
thought you said Bill Simon. I
Neil
did
Simon,
know
that was
Neil
her
Simon.
husband's
I did know
father's
Neil
brother,
Simon,
her
age
father's
91, passed
Yeah.
away. Playwright, well known and understood. Thank you very, I'm sorry? Yeah, and he did write The Odd Couple. Gentleman's recognized, yes. Yeah, I was really surprised with the number of playwrights, of plays that he has associated himself as playwright. Yeah, he did. He never got ahead of it. Yes, please, gentleman's recognized.
Perhaps it was great at comedy, but always through his comedy addressed serious issues. Chairman Sessions, always good to see you.
Welcome back.
Welcome back to you. Wish we were welcoming back our ranking member, Ms. Slaughter, unfortunately not with us. And welcome back to all members of the committee, Mr. Byrne and Ms. Collins and Ms. Burgess.
Some of your favorite members are up here.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Well, I'm here on behalf of my colleague Suzanne Bonamici, the Democratic co-lead on this bill. I was not aware that this was her uncle. This bill, 1635, passed the House as the ranking member, Mr. McGovern, stated in 2013 in the 113th Congress and the 114th Congress by wide margins. So there is bipartisan precedent for this bill. It does do some important things, such as it would ensure borrowers receive an annual counseling to help them understand the grants, that grants are better than federal student loans, and that federal student loans are better than private loans. And it would give students clarity on which financial options are better and what they should draw on first. Students would also be able to better grasp the implications of their future debt and understand the various repayment scenarios. And under this bill, schools would provide borrowers with their monthly anticipated payment under the standard payment plan and income-based repayment plans based on how much they need to borrow on their projected yearly salary. And in order to build evidence around effective financial literacy strategies, H.R. 1635 would require the Department of Education to study the effectiveness of this counseling. These are all laudable points around which there is bipartisan consensus. And I'm happy to say that all of these elements are included in the Democratic reauthorization, the Democratic version of the Higher Education Act, the AIM Higher Act. But we really know that, and I want to echo some of the sentiment of Ranking Member McGovern, that this bill does wonderful things, but it doesn't really get at the deeper issues in the way that a Neil Simon play would maybe use levity to get at the heart of the human condition. And we know that the rise in college costs are due largely to state disinvestment that has forced students and families to shoulder a greater portion of the total cost. And that's really one of the underlying sources of student indebtedness. And while this bill, I think, gets at the surface, many of the surface issues that are nonetheless important, it doesn't really address the issues that this issue of the state disinvestment. We know that Pell Grants, the foundation of our federal student aid system, that Pell Grants have not kept up with the rising cost of college, which means students are forced to make up the remaining with student loans. Again, state disinvestment has led to more families having more on family shoulders, and the cost of the Pell Grants have not kept up, which means that less grants, more more burden on families, and often they have to take it out on loans. I'm nonetheless glad that we are considering this act instead of the Republican version of the higher ed reauthorization, a very partisan bill, 4508, the Prosper Act, which makes quality higher education less accessible and more expensive by cutting $15 billion out of federal student aid. So again, we are not talking about increasing Pell Grants, reducing student indebtedness. We're talking about financial counseling, which can be beneficial, but in my mind, it's a lost opportunity of Congress's time to really work on behalf of students in America and families in America. Let me just tell you what the Prosper Act, in contrast to the Prosper Act, what the AIM Higher Act would do, would really address the deeper underlying struggles of American students and their families. It would make higher education more accessible by creating targeted programs that allow traditionally underrepresented students to enroll in college and strengthen existing access problems, simplifying the financial aid application and ensuring students have access to a quality program. The Democrats' AIM Higher Act would also make college more affordable today by investing robustly in financial aid programs and addressing the rising cost of college by creating a federal-state partnership to reduce the burden on students in the future. And I mentioned earlier in the opening that the dynamic is that states have disinvested and have reduced their support of their own public education, public higher education systems. The AIM Higher Act would address this through a federal-state partnership. And recognizing that the best measure of success is completing college, the AIM Higher Act, the bill would invest in programs and services like career counseling and campus-based childcare that will help students graduate and put them on the path to success. Now, if we can't agree that students need better access to college, more financial aid, and targeted supports to graduate, at the very least, we must agree that students should all have the information they need about their student aid to make informed decisions. So I am happy to testify on behalf of H.R. 1635, which does provide that counseling, but as I said, this bill, while laudable, really addresses the surface issues of what faces the challenges, surface challenges of what confronts America's students. It doesn't really get at the heart of the problem like a good Neil Simon play. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lamb, welcome to the Rules Committee. Mr. McGovern, his first time here.
I hope it's not his last.
Well, I told him I hope he did well enough to get invited back, and he thought he was glad to be here. So, gentlemen's right.
We welcome him.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, for having me here. I will speak to a very short amendment that I'm offering to H.R. 1635, which is simply to add veteran status in short words to the end of the act where we're talking about how success or lack of success will be measured for this new program. And I, like Mr. Woodall and many of you, got a lot of questions over the break about the Congress generally and about government generally, over whether we ever get along about anything, and also about whether we are ever held accountable for anything or whether we hold ourselves accountable, whether the programs that we authorize and spend money on are ever measured, whether they ever actually accomplish anything. So I was encouraged by the provision of this bill that actually aims to do that, and we'll try to study whether this bill makes a difference in people's lives. I mean, we want to know if these counselings actually increase degree attainment and program completion and successful student loan repayment. We don't want to make people sit through counseling just for the heck of it. So I think this is a great provision. Right now, all it includes is aggregating the data by race, ethnicity, gender, income, and disability status. And I believe that we should add veteran status to that list as well. In my experience, veterans are people with more complicated financial pictures than the average student. They are not depending on their parents. They often are parents themselves. They are not coming from their parents' homes. They often own their own homes or at least are paying their own mortgages. And so the financial counseling that could require may be a little bit different, and we're going to want to know how this financial counseling actually affects them as a population over time. And I think more than anything, looking for places where we can do more than thank veterans for their service, but actually put some muscle behind those words and put our money where our mouth is a good idea. And my hope is that this will give veterans a more level playing field when they deal with student loan companies, and over time try to help them, be able to deal at arm's length with the people that are helping them finish their education. Because despite the GI Bill, I think it's around a quarter of veterans still have to take out additional student loans. So I think this would be a great provision. We need to know if it's working and how it's affecting them differently as a group. And so I ask for this amendment to be made in order.
Thank you very much. The distinguished gentlewoman from Wyoming.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I also was able to have a very productive August and had the chance to spend a lot of time with my constituents who are very pleased with the economic progress in particular that we've seen, both because of actions we've taken in this body and also because of actions the President has taken. And I'm very pleased to be here today with the financial assistance bill that we're considering. I think it's a crucial bill. I'm very glad it came through committee in such a bipartisan fashion and has come up before. And I do think it's very important that we do everything we can to make sure that our students who are receiving financial aid get the kind of counseling that they need, as well as their parents, to be able to make the kinds of financial decisions that their future requires. So I don't have any questions. I look forward to managing the rule tomorrow, and I thank all of my colleagues for being here this evening. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry, I was getting a little career counseling myself there. This adult supervision role sometimes works, and other times it's just the way it is. Mr. Woodall?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I heard about this issue when I was home over the break. We have a great, brand-new four-year university in my district. It's called Georgia Gwinnett College. It is ranked as one of the most ethnically diverse colleges in the country. It's also ranked as one of those with the least amount of student debt coming out. About 53% of our folks are on those Pell Grants as they're going in. Got a great ROTC program over there, great veteran support center there is actually opened up by a former general and professor at West Point, and now has been passed on to one of his mentees, and it's just an amazing institution. And the tale they told was of sometimes first-generation college students, sometimes first-generation Americans coming in, filling out the financial paperwork, and having these men and women who there's no, I should have mentioned that, there's no tenure at Georgia Gwinnett College. It's you eat what you kill at Georgia Gwinnett College. If you're not performing, you don't stay. And if you are performing, you get elevated, and the students just love it because they're put in charge of playing that role in partnership. And the financial services team was talking about how they were unable to advise first-generation college students, first-generation Americans, about not taking out all the money that is available to them. And I thought, well, surely, because that's, there's always that grain of truth in every rotten regulation that comes out. There was a grain of truth that drove us in that direction. So I wanted to use your expertise here. What was it once upon a time that led us to say, in order to protect these young people, we need to protect them from the wisdom and advice and counsel of the financial services team that we're putting in place to assist them? Why do we have a vested interest today in not allowing full disclosure of loans, discouraging students from taking out loans, encouraging them to take the job in the dining hall, and instead, what was that for those of you who are subject matter experts on the committee?
Well, I can't give you the specifics of what decisions made before I was here or whatever, but I've always said exactly what you said. Whenever you look at a regulation, and particularly one that you think has been misapplied or so forth, there's some kernel of truth, some reason it's there. And, just my assumption of it by being part of it is, and seeing what's happened in colleges, the scale of debt has gone up. The cost of going to college, I know in Kentucky, going to a state school, the percentage of what a student pays or what the state puts into is decreased, or is increased for the percentage of the student. So I think we're just seeing more and more need for this moving forward. And Mr. McConnell was right. This bill addresses knowledge and counseling of the money that that you're going to take it. You don't have to have everything. You don't need everything. Get what you, and try to set out a real budget for each individual person. That's what it's about. But it doesn't still solve the fact that, states are putting less money in there. I know my state, and because of some stuff that the legislature's trying to deal with, I'm not putting it on them, some Medicaid costs and others, but there's less money going into higher education, so more money's on the families, the students, and the person. And so I think that's why we're seeing a need to relook at the way we look at bar. I don't think the need was necessarily as bad as it is now to do this kind of counseling.
Well, you want to put people in classrooms that you can trust. You want to put people in advisory capacities that you can trust. And so taking these steps to say we do trust those folks to have the students' best interests at heart, and maybe we can take some steps on the front end that will prevent some of the debt service challenges on the back end. I agree with Mr. Takano. I never dawned on me this would be a fix-it-all bill. I knew this was just going to be a rifle shot to solve one problem. I hope the committee will continue to drive forward on the rest of the package. But if we've got a chance to move a little bit in the right direction, my answer is yes. Let's get 5 yards in a cloud of dust, and then we'll start over again tomorrow and try to get 5 more.
5 yards in a cloud of dust. I like that. I mean, is it biblical, the statement, move toward the light rather than curse the darkness?
It is 5 yards in a cloud of dust, not biblical, but it is it is part of the University of Georgia culture there. And good running team. I believe that to be true.
Well, I appreciate my colleague on the Education Committee. I think this situation of states dramatically having reduced over the last 20 years their support for their public higher ed systems. Public higher ed is the public option in education, and in my mind, that is what has been a check on how fast private education grows. I think there is an outdated, disproven theory that the more money out there, the increasing grants and making it easier for students to get financial aid is what's driving the cost, and that's causing inflation. That's highly questionable. But what we do know for sure is that every one of the 50 states have dramatically reduced the amount of support they give to public higher ed, and that has shifted a tremendous amount of cost to families and students and the debt burden. So what we're doing with this bill is educating families about debt, educating them about not taking out the loan if they can avoid taking out the loan. But there's only so much of that that's going to work. And as you said, let's move in the cloud of dust. Say that again.
I went with 5 yards because I wanted to be generous. 3 yards.
3 yards in a cloud of dust.
Really,
okay.
our traditional.
Well, I'll take the 3 yards in this bill, but I will say that I think we could be doing far more because there is a bipartisan recognition of what the problem is, and if we have other strategies we can pursue, we can get students free credit by taking college courses in high school. But we have to train the teachers to be able to teach at that level. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that the federal government could be doing to actually reduce the amount of money students have to spend. It won't be enough just to say, don't take out the loan. We've got to actually make it possible so that they don't have to take the loan out because the cost of education is reduced.
My niece is just started at college this fall, and has the credits of a junior going in the door, and the family's trying to decide: do you want a 2-year college experience, or do you still want the 4-year college experience? We're talking about college experiences. We're not talking about education and how to get a job and how to meet an employer and how to do those things. We're talking about recreation time, and I look forward to that larger discussion.
Sir, this is an area of bipartisan agreement. I've talked to the chairwoman about concurrent enrollment. We don't have to reduce that experience. I mean, why not the student going 4 years and earning a bachelor's degree and progress on a master's degree? They can still have their 4-year experience, but I think we can be far more efficient with education in our country. And by the way, we don't have to just be talking about college education. We could also be talking about career and technical education. I think high school students should be finishing their high school with an actual certificate that gets them a good paying job. And I think that's part of the reason why public education gets us a bad rap, is that people aren't graduating with a credential that gets them anything anymore.
I'd wanted to yield back, Mr. Chairman, but what Mr. Takano said is absolutely right, and we just opened that high school in Forsyth County just this year. I was just out there. They've got their first 2 grades. Every child that graduates in 5 different career pathways is going to graduate with a certificate from their professional field of development, making them employable on day one if they choose not to go on, or if they choose to work their way through college going on. I invite you down to see it. It's a fantastic
I would love to
facility.
see it. I would love to make sure, we should be taking field hearings and the committee looking at, you know what, in the chairman's own state, their community college system has done some remarkable partnerships with the K-12 system. Therein lies a great opportunity. I mean, we in this country have the full institutional arsenal to address college affordability without a lot of radical surgery. We can do some fine tuning in our partnership between states and the federal government. And, I could spend another hour talking about what's going on in Mr. Sessions' own state of Texas. They've got some remarkable early college programs, they're called early college, they're also called concurrent enrollment programs. This is an incredible way to cut at least half of the cost of going to college and out of the parents' and students' pocketbook.
Mr. Chairman, you promised me if I came to the Rules Committee tonight, you would lift me up and I would feel more optimistic about Congress today than I did yesterday. And you have delivered on that promise. I thank you for that, and I thank this panel for that. I yield back.
Thank you. And that whole discussion, we could talk a lot about education lifting itself through better ideas. In fact, in Texas, we do, and in Dallas in particular, because we have certain high schools that cater to job creation. In other words, we have an arts magnet, we have a law magnet, we have a medical area, and we have an aviation area because we need more young people in our businesses, and a lot of them go to work for these companies and then go to school concurrently too. Mr. McGovern?
I thank you all for being here. Look forward to supporting the bill. Mr. Lamb, I hope your amendment is made in order. I think it's a good amendment, and the other amendments as well. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. McGovern? I'm sorry, Mr. Judge Hastings?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I certainly echo Mr. McGovern's sentiment, and I hope the amendments are made in order, especially Mr. Lamb's amendment, which I think is forthright and very easy for all of us to support. Mr. Chairman, I do have one question for my friend, Mr. Guthrie, who I think is an extremely thoughtful member of this institution. And that is, Mr. Guthrie, are you a sponsor of the Prosper Act?
Excuse me, am I a sponsor? I am a sponsor of the Prosper Act.
Yeah, how do you reconcile your effort here today, which is very commendable, with cutting $15 billion from federal student aid?
Well, what we're looking at here is application for aid and how they move forward for aid. And the Prosper Act, I haven't looked at it since this summer, quite honestly, to give you specific details to go forward on it. But my understanding, the Pell Grants are still, it's just reinserted in different areas. So aid is still there, still available, and I'll get you details.
All right, we can.
I mean, this is, what we've seen is with Indiana did it, said people took out 11% less, is that people fully understand. I've had people tell me they didn't realize they had to pay money back. They don't know interest accrued. They don't, and we have a survey that 40% said they didn't even know that they remember having any kind of counseling. So financial aid, the system, which we need to look at, the cost of college, which I think I agree with Mr. Takano, we need to look at, is this is just one part of it.
All right.
Is the costs that you're going to, the cost of the school you're going to apply to and the aid that's available, how do you do it efficiently? That's what
Right,
we're
well, I have trouble with the measure that will cut aid, and I'll talk with you more about the parts in the bill. If you notice, I sit with Mr. Scott a lot on the floor, and I have great respect for his insight with reference to education. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'd ask unanimous consent to include in the record the letter of resignation of Seth Frotman, who was at one point the ombudsman for student loans.
Without objection.
Thank you. I lift from it, Mr. Chairman, two comments. One paragraph said, the challenges of student debt affect borrowers young and old, urban and rural, in professions ranging from infantrymen to clergymen. Tackling these challenges should know no ideology or political persuasion. I'd hope to continue this critical work in partnership with you, and the letter is directed to the acting director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, our former colleague, Mick Mulvaney. He says, I had hoped to continue this critical work in partnership with you and your staff by using our authority under the law to stand up for student loan borrowers trapped in a broken system. And I underscore that, trapped in a broken system. Unfortunately, under your leadership, the Bureau has abandoned the very consumers it is tasked by Congress with protecting. Instead, you've used the Bureau to serve the wishes of the most powerful financial companies in America. A second paragraph, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Frotman says the following. The current leadership of the Bureau has turned its back on young people and their financial futures. Where we once found efficient and innovative ways to collaborate across government to protect consumers, the Bureau is now doing the bare minimum for them while simultaneously going above and beyond to protect the interests of the biggest financial companies in America. It's a very telling letter from a thoughtful person, I believe, that had the interests of trying to assist people with the borrowing. I want to share, Mr. Chairman, how much we've changed. Tomorrow is my birthday. I'll be 82 years old. And when I went to college in 1953, my mom and dad took a job as domestic servants in New York, working for very wealthy families. I worked in school and summers. And the good news there is I didn't have any student debt when I finished. I recognize things have changed. As a matter of fact, I've sent two to college, and their scholarship in large measure was right here on my muscle. Both were good students, and both wound up with loans. And I find it interesting. The reason I raise this, and this may sound a little off point, but many years ago, I represented a fellow that owed American Express $1 million. Ronnie called me from Rome. He was living in a palatial hotel. And he told me, he said, they'll settle for dime on the dollar. And I said, well, and this was before computers and everything. And lo and behold, time went on. Ronnie was in France, he was in Russia, he was in China. He went all over the world on American Express. And finally, when they realized he wasn't going to pay them, they did settle for a dime on the dollar. Now, these financial institutions could do something. What we're doing here is looking from this day forward to students that are coming on, and that is a good thing, that they receive the counseling in, out, and what have you. But that $1.5 trillion that's out there, a significant number of people are hampered considerably because they cannot pay those loans, and they will not pay them. Now, something needs to be done about that, because what's winding up happening is the economy is being crippled in substantial measure, largely because of the debt that people bear. it's an interesting loophole, and those of you that are on the committee ought to look at it. One of the things students do is when they realize, wow, I've borrowed $40,000. The loophole that's there allows them to go to get a master's and borrow some more money. It's sort of like, you know, a debt trap. And what's interesting there is they keep going, all they have to do is take a course and borrow some more money. Something is wrong with that picture. And that's what I believe we should be addressing. I think we should be addressing how to get relief for the substantial number of Americans who are caught in a debt trap by financial institutions that really could afford to give them some relief rather than continuing to add fees and cause additional problems. It's affecting this economy tremendously, and all you have to do is talk with at least one or two or maybe as many as 6 people on your staff to recognize how hard it is for them to pay these loans. I have no quarrel with your measure that's here. If it's on the floor, I'll likely vote for it. But we aren't addressing the significant problem that's out there. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. Any member of the, Dr. Michael Burgess.
Thanks, Chairman. Mr. Guthrie is my vice chairman on the Health Subcommittee, so I welcome him to the Rules Committee today. Can I just ask you, did you all consider, when you marked this bill up in the Education and Labor Workforce Committee, did you consider the amendment brought to us today by Mr. Lamb?
I don't remember we considered that amendment, but we have no objections to the amendment. I don't remember considering it. Well, he's not on the committee, so he wouldn't have brought it up before the committee. Yeah. But we didn't have anybody else bring that before the committee.
But conceptually, it's not problematic for the underlying legislation?
Not to me, no.
Okay, all right, that's very helpful. And since other people have bragged on their communities, let me just take a moment to brag on the LaGrone Center in Denton, Texas. Denton Independent School District in 2003 started an advanced technology center where a child, in addition to continuing their high school classes, can take additional classes and graduate with a court reporting certificate, barber certificate, a master plumber. I mean, all kinds of things that a kid can graduate employable. And in 2003, no one knew we were going to have a full employment economy today. In fact, things kind of went the other direction for a while. But this is a great resource in the community. And the reason I stress this is it was all brought about by private businesses in the community. Not a dime of federal dollars went into that. So it's a great success story and just shows that it can happen. If it can happen in Denton, Texas, it can happen anywhere. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Does any member of the committee, Mr. Polis? No further questions. Ms. Torres?
Mr. Chairman, I think financial counseling, is a good thing, but it's one tool in the toolbox, and there's so much more that needs to be done to ensure that our students moving forward, as they reach for higher goals to educate themselves and for a better career, that they're not given a death sentence of having to owe so much money because of predatory lenders, because of predatory schools that prey on certain students to borrow and borrow and borrow. This is one tool in a toolbox. You've all been talking and congratulating yourselves about Texas. Texas, is doing a good job, and I'm not going to take that away from you. In California, in my district, we have the Intex Center, which is a public-private partnership made up of the California Steel Company, the only steel mill of its type left in California, our community colleges in the surrounding area, and it is also in partnership with our local manufacturers. Now, they teach and they provide a certificate program for the types of jobs that are available in the community. They're not teaching to something that is not needed. They're actually teaching to the job openings that are available in the community. It is such a successful program with, some little assistance from the federal government. The steel mill provided the facility. The federal government provided some assistance so that they can purchase the equipment that they're utilizing to train, these young people. Most of them are displaced workers, but they have also started a high school program that they've been very successful at giving an opportunity to students that would normally be dropping out of high school. Last year, I invited our Secretary of Labor, Mr. Acosta, to the district, and he spent about 2 hours touring the facility. And he was absolutely excited about it. So excited that I've asked him to look at my Jobs Act, which is a bill that we have introduced now. This is the second year that I've introduced, but there hasn't been an interest in giving that bill a hearing, which is really unfortunate because with very little assistance, we can create this public-private partnerships to ensure that our future American leaders have an opportunity to do more than just go to college and get a degree where they are earning minimum wage in many cases. And by the way, if we truly care about, loan repayments, we ought to be looking at a way to raise the federal minimum wage because it is much too low currently. I hope that we'll have an opportunity to hear and to allow these amendments to come forward. I certainly have 2 amendments on here. I hope that we get a fair shot at hearing them. Did you have something to add?
Yes, Ms. Torres, regarding your statement about predatory schools and earlier referencing Mr. Lamb's comment about veterans still needing to go into debt, even with the generous GI Bill, it's often the result of the work of predatory for-profit schools that take away the generous GI Bill benefit and puts them into and causes veterans to go deeper into debt. It's interesting. So I applaud the fact that Mr. Lamb has brought forward an amendment to measure the success of this program, to include as part of how we measure a study of how this financial education affects veterans. But if we really wanted to help veterans, we would do what the AIM Hire Act does, which is to close the 90-10 loophole, which allows for-profit colleges to count GI Bill money as federal, to not count it as federal dollars, to exclude it from their accounting. And this has the effect of incentivizing the targeting of veterans by these for-profit institutions. It incentivizes the predatory behavior. Incidentally, the majority's version of the higher ed bill, the Prosper Act, would eliminate any safeguards, would eliminate the 90-10 rule instead of closing the loophole that it presents. So I wish we were closing the loophole. I'm fortunately glad that we're not considering at all the possibility that we would eliminate any protections at all in the current law, which is what the majority's bill would do. But I'm very thankful that Mr. Lamb has brought forward a measure to increase protections for our veterans.
And I yield back.
Thank you very much. I have a question. What protections are you given? What protections are you giving that the gentleman just spoke of?
In the amendment, sir, I don't know if protection is necessarily the
Okay, thank you.
word we're looking for.
It's to
Yeah.
include their data and information.
Correct,
I'm sorry.
Okay.
which would
I'm sorry.
allow us to build on that.
I'm not trying to take anybody on.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I appreciate that. Is there any other member that would seek time? The distinguished gentleman from Alabama.
Mr. Chairman, I'm a very proud member of the Education and Workforce Committee, a very proud member of Mr. Guthrie's subcommittee that this legislation has gone through a couple of times. There was a recent article that came out, Mr. Guthrie, you may have seen it, that referred to a study of people who had large amounts of student loan debt and had either defaulted or were in danger of defaulting, and not a single person had received financial counseling. This is not a small thing. This is a major thing. I had to be a financial aid student when I was in college. My parents never gone to college, so they couldn't afford to pay for my college, so I borrowed money. I never borrowed money before. I didn't know what a promissory note was. Thankfully, there was somebody there at the financial aid office that sat down with me, explained to me what all those pieces of paper meant and what it would mean over the course of my life to have to pay that back month at a time. Well, I can't imagine me taking out all that debt and not having somebody sit down and explain it to me with as little background as I had in my family to do that. And yet, it's been rampant in higher education in America, rampant. And it's not just for-profits. It's public institutions as well. To their great shame, I would say that they're not doing that. In fact, some of the worst offenders are large public institutions that are not taking the time to sit down with their students to make sure they know what they're doing. I don't care what type of institution of higher education you are. I ran the two-year college system in Alabama, and I'll be just as hard on them as I would be on anybody else. But it should be incumbent, and I hate that we have to pass a law to make them do it. They'll do it anyway. It's incumbent upon these institutions of higher education that are benefiting from receiving that money, because it flows through the student right to the institution, that they sit down and take the time to make sure these students understand what they're doing. I do believe if we had done that in years past, we wouldn't have $1.5 trillion in student debt. So yes, we've got a problem that's been created before now, but let's stop creating the problem, and that's what this does. So I want to congratulate you on this bill. It is extremely important. I'm glad it's bipartisan. It just shows that we do good bipartisan things. And yes, this was something I heard about during my August work district period when I had 12 town halls and met with dozens of groups of people who care deeply about their children going into debt, care deeply about their own debt. And when I brought this idea up to them, 100% of the people said, that's a really good idea. So thank you for doing it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any other member that would seek time? I want to thank all three of you for taking time to be with us. Please remember, our stenographer, Sharon, would appreciate receiving anything that you brought in writing to complete the record properly. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
I want to acknowledge tonight I have three interns from my office that are here. Elizabeth Simpson. Elizabeth, good to see you. SMU, Southern Methodist University, class of 2018, majored in political science from Granite Bay, California, and she graduated. Congratulations. Matthew Ziegler, Texas A&M, class 2018, graduate, majored in agricultural economics from Dallas, Texas, and Charles Fieger, Baylor University, where my son goes, class of 2018, majors in political science from Rockwall, Texas. And we're delighted also to have these three recent college graduates that are not only up on the Hill, but looking for a job. And I want to thank all three of them out. They've come up to Washington because they all believe in what we're trying to accomplish up here on behalf of the American people. Thank you very much. Okay. Let's see. Before we go any further, I've had several conversations in my ear about where we're trying to proceed, and the correct answer is? So how long? Okay. So I've been advised that we were, as some of the committee may know, we received some of our amendments a little bit later, and we do meetings and we do check-in with other committees, and we do not have all of that completely finalized, even though we've started that earlier this afternoon. Some of the committees just got back to us. So pending our ability to finalize our work, we're going to be subject to call of chair for a few minutes. We would anticipate it be about 10 minutes or so. So subject to call of chair, we'll be back. Rules Committee come to order. Chairman, now being received a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 1635, the Empowering Students Through Enhanced Financial Counseling Act, a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Education and Workforce. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule makes in order only those amendments printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and unopponent. It shall not be subject to amendment and shall not be subject to demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part A of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2 of the rule provides for consideration of H.R. 4606, the Ensuring Small-Scale LNG Certainty and Access Act, under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule makes an order as original text for the purposes of amendment. The amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Energy and Commerce, now printed in the bill, and provides that it shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The rule makes an order only those amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and unopponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to demand for division of the question. Rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part B of the report. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
Thank the distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma. Is there amendment or discussion?
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman's recognized.
first I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert on the record the statement of Congresswoman Maxine Waters on H.R. 1635.
Without objection.
And then I have an amendment. To the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the amendment to H.R. 1635 by Representatives Lamb and Peters, number 12, which would require the Department of Education to disaggregate by veteran status when conducting the longitudinal study on the effectiveness of student loan counseling.
Thank you very much. Discussion? Those in favor of the McGovern amendment, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no? No.
Ask for a roll call, Mr.
Noes have it, noes have it. Gentlemen, ask for a roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Buck? Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney, no. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Polis, aye. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
The gentleman could please see if how the distinguished gentleman from Louisville, Texas has counted his vote.
Mr. Burgess is not recorded.
If you could please ask the gentleman.
Mr. Burgess, no. Total is 4 yeas, 8 nays.
The amendment's not agreed to, not agreed to. Further amendments or discussion? Vote now be on the a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Ask for a roll call.
Gentlemen, ask for a roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins? Aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne? Aye. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse? Aye. Mr. Buck? Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney? Aye. Mr. McGovern?
No.
Mr. McGovern? No. Mr. Hastings?
No.
Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Polis?
No.
Mr. Polis? No. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman? Aye.
Clerk will report the total.
8 yeas, 4 nays.
The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the distinguished gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, will be handling this for Republicans.
And Ms. Torres will be handling it for the
Ms.
Democrats.
Torres will be handling this for Democrats. Is there any other question for the committee at this time? Judge Hastings, thank you. Our next meeting has been set for tomorrow at 3:00 p.m. on H.R. 6691, the Community Safety and Security Act of 2018. Thank you very much. Appreciate your attendance for the meeting tonight. This finishes our work for the day. Mrs. Torres?